You and I, along with our children and grandchildren, will be paying the cost of the 2008 bank bailout for decades to come. The Bank of England says the banks are now fixed and it could never happen again. After reading a new report, that looks like total BS. UKIP may not have achieved a landslide in last year's general election, but their leading lights have tended to be among the most sophisticated politicians when it comes to finance. Nigel Farage has a city background, while their one-man parliamentary party, Douglas Carswell, has always talked sense on monetary matters. So when their grandly titled Parliamentary Resource Unit issued a new report on the state of the banks, Uncle Graham thought he'd take a look. Mark Carney has been making soothing noises that Britain's banks are back on track. After putting the banks through a theoretical stress test, the Bank of England has concluded that they have sufficient capital on their balance sheets to survive a severe global stress scenario. But of course there's a rather cosy clique in place here. If the banks look good, Mark Carney looks good. If he wants a job on the board of a major bank when his term as governor expires, he's a shoo-in if he trills nice words about his potential employers. UKIP's report questions the validity of the measures imposed by the Bank of International Settlements, the famous Basel tests. We're up to Basel III now, and that has two main metrics to see if banks have enough capital relative to the risks they're taking. They need to have 7% of what's called Tier 1 capital for their riskiest assets, and a leverage ratio of common equity to liabilities of 3%. In other words, for every £100 at risk, they need just £3 on the balance sheet. Let me put that another way. To meet the stress test requirements of Basel III, every £97 at risk is covered by just £3 of reserves. Here's a comparison that takes us back to the heady days of 2007. Imagine you buy a house somewhere up north for £100,000. The bank decides to give you a 97% mortgage, so you only need to put £3,000 into the transaction. If house prices fall by just 3%, the bank repossesses the house and you've been wiped out. Except under this stress test, it's the bank that has the 3,000 against the 97,000 at risk. Just a tiny reversal of fortune would see the banks underwater again. So who would have to step in and rescue them? This time, taking a cue from Cyprus and Greece, it might be shareholders, bondholders, and even deposit holders who take the first hit. If that was insufficient, it would be back to the good old taxpayer to foot the bill. Money Week's James Ferguson broadly agrees with the UKIP findings. He believes America's banks are now fixed, UK banks are at best halfway through the process, and European banks are barely at the starting gate. So we can't afford any complacency. We've already seen the worst start to a new year in the financial markets for decades. How exposed are you to UK and European banks at the moment, either as shareholder, bondholder, or depositor? Douglas Carswell suggests that the leverage ratio needs to increase fivefold from 3% to 15%. That's about as likely to happen as a majority UKIP government. But it should wake us all from our complacency that the crisis is over and everything's back to normal. We still have emergency interest rates. We have a government that relies on the banks to buy its bonds, and a central bank that seems cosier than ever with its mates in the big banks. What could possibly go wrong? If you think 2008 has been consigned to the history books never to be repeated, be very careful out there. Before the financial crisis, oil tankers were fetching $100,000 a day. Now they regard $10,000 as a good payday.